Imagine you're a textbook economist. You need to explain where money came from. So you tell a story, a very clean, very logical story. Once upon a time, people bartered. A farmer traded grain for a cobbler's shoes. A hunter swapped venison for a pot. It was simple, direct, honest. But it had a fatal flaw, the double coincidence of wants. You had to want exactly what your trading partner had, and they had to want exactly what you had. That friction, the story goes, made people invent money to grease the wheels of commerce. First barter, then coins, then credit. Neat, tidy, wrong. For over 100 years, economists have been telling us this same story. Long ago, people traded chickens for shoes, grain for tools, and because bartering was difficult, they invented money to make trading easier. The story is so intuitive it has appeared in introductory economics textbooks for generations. There is only one problem with it. No one has ever found any place, anywhere, where economic relations between members of a community took the form economists predicted. I'll give you 20 chickens for that cow. Not one. Not anywhere on earth. In her seminal 1985 paper, Barter and Economic Disintegration, published in the journal Man, volume 20, number 1, Cambridge anthropologist Caroline Humphrey, who has held appointments in Cambridge's Department of Social Anthropology since 1978 and has been a Fellow of King's College since the same year, concluded, no example of a barter economy, pure and simple, has ever been described, let alone the emergence from it of money. All available ethnography suggests that there never has been such a thing. Economists predicted that every pre-monetary society would look like a barter economy. Empirical observation has revealed that the actual number of observable cases out of thousands studied is 0%. So if humanity didn't barter its way to money, what did we do instead? The answer begins not in a marketplace, but around a fire. In 1925, French anthropologist Marcel Mauss published a landmark essay called Essai sur le don, the gift, in the academic journal L'Année Sociologique. It would later be republished as a standalone book, but its original form was a long journal essay, and its impact was immediate. Mauss explored the nature of gift exchange in various cultures, particularly in archaic societies, arguing that economic activities are deeply intertwined with social and cultural practices. His central finding was deceptively simple. Gifts are not merely objects but carry moral and social obligations among individuals and groups, and in contrasting modern economic exchanges with those in societies such as the Trobriand Islanders and Northwestern American tribes, he illustrated that the act of giving is often laden with expectations of repayment, creating enduring bonds between people. Mauss identified 3 key obligations surrounding gift exchange: the obligation to give, to receive, and to repay. This is not charity. It is not altruism. It is something far more powerful, a web of mutual obligation that binds a community together. When you give your neighbor a side of venison after a successful hunt, he is not simply grateful. He is in your debt, not a debt written on paper or clay, a social debt enforced by reputation, by honor, by the very fabric of belonging. A hunter shared his catch, knowing that he would be repaid for his contribution later. A social credit system existed prior to capital. By contributing to the tribe, other members owed a favor. These human economies operated on transactions of IOUs with no currency involved. Nowhere was this more dramatically illustrated than in the Pacific. Anthropologist Bronisław Malinowski spent years living among the Trobriand Islanders of Papua New Guinea in the late 1910s. He described a system known as the Kula, an exchange system among the people of the Trobriand Islands of southeast Melanesia, in which permanent contractual partners traded traditional valuables following an established ceremonial pattern and trade route. Only 2 kinds of articles, traveling in opposite directions around a rough geographic ring several hundred miles in circumference, were exchanged: red shell necklaces and white shell bracelets, which were not consumable nor media of exchange outside the ceremonial system. These objects had no practical use. Kula items have no monetary value and cannot be converted into consumer goods. And yet men sailed hundreds of miles across open ocean for them. Why? Because the Kula was not about objects. Kula exchange involved a complex system of gifts and countergifts whose rules were laid down by custom. The system was based on trust, as obligations were not legally enforceable. However, strong social obligations and the cultural value system, in which liberality was exalted as the highest virtue while meanness was condemned as shameful, created powerful pressures to play by the rules. The Kula ring was, in essence, a social credit network spanning a chain of islands, no coins, no markets, no barter. Just obligation, reputation, and the slow circulation of debt. Among the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest of North America, the principle took a different and more theatrical form, the potlatch. The potlatch was a ceremony where gifts were instruments of social status and alliance building. A chief demonstrated his power not by hoarding wealth but by distributing it, sometimes spectacularly, sometimes destructively. In the specific form of the potlatch, the value of the reciprocation was expected to be higher than the value of the gift received. To refuse an invitation to a potlatch was to signal weakness. The gift was not free. It never was. Whereas the traditional account puts barter before money and money before debt, many anthropologists and economic historians, most prominently David Graeber, though his broader thesis remains contested, argue that barter tends only to emerge in pre-industrialized societies, when exchange happens outside a familiar cultural context. In other words, strangers barter. Communities run on debt. Now come forward several thousand years and 1,000 miles to the east, to the floodplains between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, to a civilization that invented cities, law, the wheel, and the world's first financial system. Some of the earliest known systems for managing value and resources appeared in Mesopotamia over 5,000 years ago. These were not created by markets or traders. They were designed and controlled by temples and palaces. In cities like Uruk and Babylon, temples stored grain, tools, and textiles. Evidence suggests that over 5,000 years ago, the ancient Mesopotamians began recording quantities on clay tablets. The earliest known examples of proto-cuneiform writing, dating to approximately 3200 to 3000 BCE, were discovered in Uruk. Here is where history delivers its most surprising lesson. The earliest texts were not written by poets or philosophers, but by accountants. The first things human beings ever thought worth writing down were not prayers or epic poems. They were IOUs. Cuneiform tablets found in ancient Sumerian cities revealed detailed records of who lent what to whom, how much interest was charged, and when repayment was due. Temples functioned as proto-banks, storing wealth and facilitating loans using agricultural surplus like grain. People gave part of their harvest or labor to the temple, and in return received food, cloth, or other goods. These exchanges were carefully recorded on clay tablets using cuneiform. These tablets worked like ledgers, a recording of what each person had given and what they owed. There were no coins or notes. Instead, value was measured using agreed references like weights of grain. Think about what this means. The shekel, that ancient word we still echo today, was not originally a coin. The shekel originated in ancient Mesopotamia around 3000 BC during the Sumerian period as a fundamental unit of weight, initially measured in barley grains or silver, serving as a precursor to formalized currency in early economic transactions. It was a unit of weight in a ledger, an abstraction, a promise, a debt denominated in grain or silver that almost never changed hands physically. Credit recorded in cuneiform of ancient Sumer shows a thriving economy in which accounts were kept in units of silver, but silver did not actually circulate. It was, like modern money, a placeholder unit, an abstraction. The interest rates these ancient lenders charged were precise and customary long before they were ever written down. When the famous Code of Hammurabi was set down around 1750 BCE, it did not invent these rates. Scholars broadly agree it was codifying long-established practice, setting legal maximums on rates already in use. Law 88 of the Code explicitly stipulated that for grain loans a merchant may collect interest of 33 1/3%, and for silver loans 20%. These figures correspond to the standard Mesopotamian sexagesimal fractions, 1/3 and 1/5 of the principal, already familiar from scribal training texts predating Hammurabi. Whether the code created new law or simply gave royal authority to existing custom, it fixed those figures as legal maximums that, according to surviving contracts, remained in force for well over 1,000 years. People often fell into debt, a conclusion based on numerous tablet letters describing people in various kinds of trouble. Many debtors became slaves. The situation got so out of hand in Babylon that King Hammurabi decreed that no one could be enslaved for more than 3 years for debt. Debt was not a side effect of this civilization, it was the engine of it. Now cross the map to medieval England. The Mesopotamian clay tablet has an unlikely air, and it is made of wood. A tally stick was a length of polished wood, typically hazelwood, used to record a transaction. When a debt was created or a tax paid, notches and grooves were carved into the stick to represent the amount. The stick was then split lengthwise, right down the middle through the notches. The resulting two halves each had a perfect mirror image of the notches, and a portion of the written text. The longer piece, called the stock, was given to the creditor, the person who was owed money. The unique grain of the wood made forgery almost impossible. The split tally was accepted as legal proof in medieval courts. The most prominent use of the split tally as a form of currency was when Henry Vaughan introduced the tally stick system in medieval England around 1100. Tally sticks served as exchequer accounting records for several centuries, detailing payments of taxes made to the royal treasury. These wooden IOUs eventually became transferable. One person's claim on the crown could be traded to settle another person's debt. The creditor's half of the split stick was called the stock, a word rooted in Old English for a piece of wood or trunk, and the Science Museum Group's collection notes that this is where the modern meaning of the word for a finance certificate originates. Whether that tally stick stock is the direct etymological ancestor of stocks in the financial sense remains genuinely debated. The OED's own entry notes that the origins of the financial senses are obscure, and that possibly several different lines of development may have blended. What is clear is that tally sticks were central to English royal finance for centuries, and the word stock for a financial instrument was in use well before the Bank of England's founding in 1694. The story of how tally sticks ended is almost too good to be true. The fiercely traditional exchequer continued to use tallies until the system was officially abolished in 1826, leaving the government with a peculiar problem: what to do with the centuries' worth of old, settled tally sticks filling the cellars of the Houses of Parliament. In October 1834, the Clerk of Works, Richard Webley, received instructions from Treasury officials to clear the old tally sticks while Parliament was adjourned. Rather than having them carted away or burned in open air, he ordered them burned in the two underfloor furnaces in the basement of the House of Lords, a decision that fell to two workmen, Joshua Cross and Patrick Furlong, to carry out. The furnaces were overfed. A chimney fire spread through the flues running beneath the floor of the Lord's chamber and up through the walls. By evening, smoke was pouring out of the building. The ensuing inferno raged through the night, engulfing and destroying almost the entire medieval Palace of Westminster, including the chambers of both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The official inquiry found various people guilty of negligence and foolishness: the Clerk of Works, the housekeeper who ignored warning signs of excess smoke and heat, and the workmen themselves all bore a share of the blame. Firefighters could only save a few ancient sections, such as Westminster Hall. The debt records of England burned down its own parliament. So what does all of this tell us? Debt and credit historically appeared before money, which itself appeared before barter, the opposite of the narrative given in standard economics texts dating back to Adam Smith. The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, described humanity's supposed propensity to truck, barter, and exchange as the natural origin of commerce. Smith wrongly assumed that barter was a major part of exchange in indigenous societies. The Wealth of Nations contains no testimony from any indigenous peoples. The true sequence, drawn from archaeology, anthropology, and the clay tablets themselves, runs in the opposite direction. First, the gift and social obligation, enforced by community, honor, and the memory of shared favors. Then, the ledger, the IOU, the temple account, credit record not on paper but in wet clay pressed by a reed. Only much later, the coin, the market, and the anonymous transaction between strangers. Many anthropologists state that when barter did appear, it was due to the disappearance of money, a fallback between strangers or in the ruins of collapsed monetary systems, not a primitive stage that money evolved from. This argument, most forcefully associated with David Graeber's work, remains actively debated among economists and economic historians, some of whom dispute both the scope of the anthropological evidence and the conclusions drawn from it. But the core finding, that no pure barter economy has ever been documented as the origin of money, rests on a century of ethnographic observation that has not been overturned. This matters far beyond economic history, because the story we tell about the origins of money shapes the story we tell about ourselves. If money came from barter, from individuals rationally trading surplus, then markets are natural, pre-political, and government is the intruder. But if money came from debt, from obligation, from the temple and the palace and the tally stick of the crown, then money was never just a neutral tool. It was always a social relationship, always a question of power, always a record of what we owe each other. The first IOU was not written on paper. It was not stamped in metal. It was carved in memory, in the social brain of a hunter who shared his kill and knew, without saying a word, that he would be repaid. Money, it turns out, is as old as trust, and debt is older still. Every episode of the Agora takes many hours to research, verify, and craft because the story of money deserves to be told properly. If you found this worthwhile, subscribe and turn on notifications to follow the series as it unfolds. Thank you for watching.